In a heated live debate, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and the fiery conservative Ben Shapiro face off over free speech in the United States. When Shapiro attacks Crockett, calling her a threat to democracy, she remains unfazed. She strikes back. With 11 million viewers watching, Crockett exposes Shapiro with irrefutable evidence. Shapiro, exposed and losing his credibility, is left speechless, unable to offer any defense, leaving the entire studio in stunned silence in an atmosphere so tense it was almost suffocating. What did Jasmine finally say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in the CNN studio dimmed slightly as the broadcast went live, and for a moment, the tension in the air was almost physical, coiled like a spring, waiting to snap. This wasn't just another political segment. It was a collision course between two opposing forces who had, for months, circled each other through headlines, sound bites, and social media jabs. On one side of the glossy white table sat Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator with millions of followers and a reputation built on speed-talking takedowns. He wore his trademark suit like armor and his smile like a challenge. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm but visibly coiled, not with anger, but with clarity. Her presence was different, grounded, unflinching. This wasn't theater for her. This was personal. This was lived experience being weighed against performance. The moderator welcomed viewers across the nation and announced the topic of the night. Free speech or hate speech? Where is the line? The question wasn't new, but the stakes had changed. In recent months, hate crimes had risen, protests had turned violent, online rhetoric had crossed into real-world harm, and in that moment, with two voices at the center of America's cultural divide, this wasn't a debate about theory. It was a battle over what truth looks like in an age where lies wear suits. Ben Shapiro moved first. He didn't hesitate. He never does. With his signature rhythm and a practiced ease, he leaned in and delivered the opening blow. Let's not pretend we don't know what this is, he said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut. We're living in an age where free speech is under attack, not from governments, but from professional victims. The left has become a fire hose of outrage, and politicians like Ms. Crockett here, well, they've turned virtue signaling into a full-time career. He smiled just long enough to let the barb sink in. Congresswoman Crockett is a passionate defender of democracy, to be sure. A firebrand, you might say. But sometimes that fire gets out of control. Sometimes the very people claiming to protect the truth are the first to burn it down. There was a flicker of laughter from a small section of the crowd. Nervous, almost rehearsed. The kind that doesn't come from belief, but from loyalty. The moderator didn't interrupt. The camera stayed tight on Jasmine. She didn't shift. She didn't frown. She simply waited until the last echo of his voice disappeared, and then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, her fingers folded together as she leaned into her mic, not to shout, but to be heard. Thank you for reminding us, Ben, that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most honest. The words dropped with weight. No fire, no fury, just a quiet indictment that felt heavier than any insult. Free speech is sacred, but it's not an excuse to slander or to mislead millions just because outrage sells. Her eyes didn't leave his. When you twist facts about communities that are already under siege, when you monetize fear disguised as commentary, you're not defending liberty. You're feeding something else entirely. There was a stillness in the room, like the breath before impact. Free speech doesn't mean free lies, and it doesn't mean giving a platform to those who punch down, then pretend it's a debate. For a moment, even the hum of the studio equipment seemed to fall silent. Shapiro blinked, twice. The moderator glanced between them but said nothing. Something had shifted. The ground was no longer neutral. This wasn't a back-and-forth exchange. It had become something far more raw, the exposure of what happens when those with microphones confuse provocation with principle, and the moment someone refuses to let them get away with it. But Shapiro wasn't finished, not by a long shot. As Crockett's words settled into the room like smoke after a controlled burn, he leaned forward, his expression shifting from smug amusement to sharp-edged accusation. And what he said next wasn't just a counterpoint. It was a calculated detonation. Ben Shapiro adjusted the cuffs of his blazer with theatrical precision before locking eyes with the audience and delivering his next line with icy deliberation. "Let's not forget who we're dealing with," he said, every syllable crisp, cold, and aimed. "This is the same Congresswoman who mocked a sitting governor with a disability, who referred to Greg Abbott, a paraplegic, as Hot Wheels on social media." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He was no longer debating. He was prosecuting. That's not a slip. That's not satire. That's targeted cruelty from someone who claims to speak for the marginalized. He let the accusation hang in the air like a slow-moving guillotine, then pivoted toward the camera with the rehearsed cadence of a man who'd spent years making his outrage profitable. "You don't get to play champion of justice while mocking those who can't walk. You don't get to preach inclusion while you laugh at a man in a wheelchair." Turning back to Jasmine, his eyes hardened with performative disgust. "Tell me, Congresswoman, what part of that joke was for the people? Or was it just for applause?" There was a moment, half a heartbeat, where the room forgot to breathe. The studio lights caught beads of sweat forming on the brows of the production crew. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to clap, gasp, or look away. What had begun as a political exchange now teetered on the edge of something much more personal, much more dangerous, a public reckoning painted as moral outrage. But for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. It was familiar, the way truth gets distorted by those who never had to live beneath its weight. She didn't recoil. She didn't fire back instantly. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, to simmer, to become its own kind of statement. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let hypocrisy wear a halo. If Shapiro wanted to drag her into the courtroom of public morality, she would bring the full case file on him, unedited, uncensored, and impossible to ignore. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't smirk. She simply reached for the tablet beside her, smoothly, almost quietly, but with the kind of control that turns a courtroom still. Then her voice cut through the rising tension with surgical clarity. "You want to talk about cruelty, Ben? Let's talk about what lives on your own platform." With a tap of her finger, the studio's central screen flickered to life. A video clip rolled, one that had circulated online but had never been played like this. On national television, in front of its own creator. The footage showed Ben Shapiro mocking a transgender teenager's voice during a Daily Wire broadcast. His tone was dismissive, exaggerated, theatrical. The crowd in the background laughed. And then came the next clip, quieter, more insidious. Shapiro on air again, discussing children with autism, describing them as social liabilities within the context of public education policy. No punchline, just cold detachment, as if human worth could be graphed on a fiscal chart. The images hit the studio like a silent explosion. No one moved, but something in the air had shifted. Decency had been replaced with disgust, and no one could pretend otherwise. Crockett let the silence stretch, not to dominate the moment, but to give the truth its own room to breathe. Then she turned back to him, not to yell, but to sentence. "You don't get to build an empire on belittling the vulnerable, and then step onto this stage pretending to be the moral compass of the room." Her voice didn't rise. It sank into the room like a weight too heavy to lift. The audience fractured almost instantly. Some shook their heads, shielding their eyes from the screen like they were trying to unsee something they'd once defended. Others muttered in defense, "It's satire. It's taken out of context." But their voices lacked force, like they no longer fully believed their own excuses. In the front row, a mother with a son on the autism spectrum sat frozen, lips pressed tightly together, eyes locked on Crockett. She wasn't clapping. She was listening. And the moderator? She didn't speak. Her polished neutrality had faltered. No cue card could guide her through what had just happened. Shapiro didn't reply right away. His expression, so often smug or condescending, was still, but not calm. He stared at the monitor with the same face a man wears when the courtroom suddenly turns against him. And in that silence, Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't lean in. She just looked out across the audience and let them sit with what they'd seen. This, her presence said without words, is the kind of cruelty I've been told to ignore, to rise above, to let slide in the name of civility. But she didn't. Not this time, and not tonight. Because tonight, cruelty met consequence, and the nation was watching. But Jasmine wasn't done laying bare the double standards. Because the most dangerous kind of censorship isn't loud and obvious. It's dressed in contracts, enforced in silence, and carried out by those who preach freedom the loudest. She didn't raise her voice, but something shifted in her tone, like a warning just before the floor gives way. Jasmine Crockett's expression was steady, not angry, but resolute, as if she were about to lift the veil on a truth too many were willing to ignore. She didn't turn to Shapiro this time. She spoke to the audience, to the cameras, to the millions of Americans watching who'd been sold a version of free speech that only worked one way. When Candace Owens said something Ben didn't like, she didn't get a rebuttal. She got a gag order. The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. She didn't get invited to a debate. She got silenced by her own platform. And then, without flourish or drama, she tapped the screen in front of her. Behind them, the studio monitor illuminated a digital document. Legal language, signatures, confidentiality clauses. A section highlighted in yellow read plainly, "Subject is prohibited from addressing the topic of Israeli foreign policy on any Daily Wire-affiliated platform or public broadcast." One name was unredacted. Candace Owens. Jasmine let the audience take it in. Let the truth settle into their skin. This wasn't a theory. It wasn't a Twitter rumor. It was paper. It was policy. It was proof. Here's the truth. When Candace criticized Israeli policy, when she stepped outside the party line, Daily Wire didn't defend her right to speak. They punished her for it. They banned her from addressing the issue publicly, even as Ben publicly pretended to welcome debate. Her voice didn't rise, but the steel inside it was unmistakable. She wasn't lobbing an opinion. She was delivering evidence, the kind that rewrites reputations. Shapiro shifted for the first time in minutes, not dramatically, but enough. His jaw flexed. His hand adjusted his tie. But he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. He knew what was on that screen, and he knew what it meant for the image he had cultivated for over a decade. The audience didn't react with claps or cheers. They didn't need to. Their stillness spoke louder. A few leaned forward. A few pulled out their phones. And one woman in the front row, maybe a journalist, maybe just a mother, whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. And then Jasmine turned the knife, not with malice, but with clarity. This is the freedom Ben defends, a freedom that depends on whether your opinion aligns with his funding. Her voice softened, not to retreat, but to draw the truth even closer. Tell me, America, is that freedom of speech, or is it just speech for sale? And in that moment, even the cameras seemed unsure where to look, because the spotlight wasn't on Ben anymore. It was on the system, and it was burning. The moment her final question hit the air. Is that freedom of speech or just speech for sale? Ben Shapiro broke his silence, and in doing so, he walked straight into the very trap he had helped build. Ben's response came not with hesitation, but with heat, fast, reflexive, defensive. The carefully measured tone he wore like a second skin cracked open, replaced by something sharper, more exposed. "That's a lie," he snapped, his voice ringing through the studio with the kind of force that draws eyes for all the wrong reasons. Candace wasn't silenced. She left on her own terms. She made her choices and we respected them. The words tumbled out fast, but something in them betrayed panic disguised as confidence. He gestured, dismissively, toward the document on the screen, his hand slicing the air like he could will the damage away. There was no gag order. No one at Daily Wire censors anyone. We encourage internal debate. We always have. He leaned forward, the volume rising just enough to feel like a crack in the dam. You don't get to rewrite history because it suits your narrative, Congresswoman. And with that, the table between them stopped being furniture. It became a fault line. Jasmine didn't react to his anger. She didn't even look surprised. She moved with the calm weight of someone who'd seen this kind of unraveling before, except now, the unraveling wasn't hers. Her fingers slid across the table, placing a single printed sheet just inches from his hand. At the same time, the studio screen behind them shifted again, the tension rising as the next layer of truth was revealed. Not shouted, but shown. This time it wasn't theory or accusation, it was documentation. The email appeared in full on the broadcast screen. The studio lights seemed to dim as if even they knew something irreversible had just surfaced. A bolded subject line, containment strategy, Owens. The sender, Benjamin Shapiro. The language beneath was unambiguous, deliberate. Given the sensitivity of the issue and the damage to our pro-Israel stance, Candace must refrain from further commentary. I'll handle the language. Make it final. The words didn't need context. They were the context. A hush swept across the studio like a cold wind through glass. This wasn't an opinion or interpretation. This was the very proof Ben had just denied existed, in his own words, with a timestamp and digital trail. In the second row, someone whispered, "Oh my God," but no one dared speak louder. Shapiro stared at the screen, his posture unchanged, but his face a map of tension, jaw tight, eyes fixed, lips parted slightly as if reaching for a rebuttal that simply wasn't there. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. There was no victory in her eyes, only gravity. She looked at him, not with smugness, but with the unmistakable disappointment of someone watching a person unravel under the weight of their own contradiction. You didn't silence her for lying, Ben. You silenced her for telling a truth that didn't serve your brand. Her voice, low and steady, filled the space like a final ruling. No applause followed, no immediate reaction, just silence thick with realization. Because what the audience had just witnessed wasn't a debate point lost. It was something more damning, a breach between a man's persona and his practice. A moment when the scaffolding of self-righteousness collapsed under the simple pressure of his own words. And in that collapse, the truth wasn't just exposed, it was undeniable. The email hit like a hammer, but it was the echo that revealed the fracture. Because the truth didn't just expose a man, it split the room. The studio didn't erupt, it ruptured. A slow, jagged tear through the fragile illusion of neutrality that had held the room together until that moment. On the left side, a cluster of Shapiro loyalists sprang to their feet, their voices rising in overlapping waves of protest. "That's doctored," someone shouted. "Context matters," another yelled, desperation bleeding through every syllable. Their faces were tight with anger, not just at the email, but at what it revealed, that the man they followed with unwavering loyalty was no longer untouchable. On the right, it was a different eruption. Crockett's supporters stood without waiting for a cue. Their applause thundered, not out of celebration, but vindication. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others simply stood, arms crossed, as if witnessing long-awaited justice being delivered live. Phone screens lit up across the room, capturing the moment, immortalizing it before the world could twist it. Hashtags were typed in real time. The battle wasn't just in the room anymore. It was on the internet, in living rooms, in text threads from coast to coast. The moderator struggled to pull the show back into format, her voice thin against the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we need to allow the discussion to continue." But her pleas evaporated into the chaos. The energy no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the rupture. The tension no longer simmered beneath the surface. It ruled the room. The stage lights flickered faintly, almost as if reacting to the volatility in the air. What was meant to be a debate had become something far more dangerous, a moment of truth that refused to be managed. And then Jasmine moved, not physically, but emotionally. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't raise her voice. She let the storm swirl around her, standing rooted like someone who'd weathered far worse than noise. When she finally spoke, her words sliced through the uproar, not by volume, but by weight. "I don't want applause," she said. Her voice didn't need a mic. It carried because it came from somewhere deeper than strategy. "I want awareness." The room didn't go silent. It froze. "I don't want the noise. I want the reckoning." No flourish, no performance, just raw, direct truth. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for approval, but for accountability. "This isn't about me. It's about every voice that's been buried so that power could keep speaking uninterrupted." And just like that, the clapping faltered, not from disagreement, but from understanding. People lowered their hands slowly, as if realizing applause had never been enough. Crockett hadn't come to win a room. She came to expose what that room had too often concealed. And in that moment, without raising her voice, she had taken back the floor and given it to the truth. But just as the silence was beginning to settle, just as the truth was finally allowed to breathe, Ben Shapiro struck back, not with words of defense, but with a weapon as old as politics itself: manipulation by omission. There was a flicker in Shapiro's eyes, not fear, not guilt, but calculation. The kind of calculation that happens in milliseconds when power senses it's slipping through the cracks. He gave a near-invisible nod to the control booth. A beat later, the screen behind them changed again. Gone were the documents, the emails, the paper trail of accountability. In their place, video footage, grainy but clear, flashed across the giant monitor. Jasmine Crockett stood on a church stage in South Dallas, fire in her voice, conviction in her posture. She spoke to a crowd, not with rehearsed slogans, but with raw, unfiltered urgency. The video, however, had been cut with surgical intent. It skipped the full speech and jumped directly to one line: "We don't owe silence to those who thrive on our suffering. We will confront them." Loudly. Then the screen froze on her face mid-sentence, weaponizing her expression. Passion stripped of context. Emotion framed as menace. The air in the studio tightened again. Shapiro leaned in, every syllable sharpened like a blade. "This," he said coldly, "is not advocacy. This is incitement. This is what happens when rage is given a microphone and no boundaries. She isn't defending justice. She's threatening anyone who disagrees with her." His words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the quiet venom of someone trying to turn truth into something dangerous. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't have to. He was speaking to the audience now, both in the room and across the country. He was counting on their unfamiliarity with her, on their distance from the lived pain behind her words. Some members of the crowd murmured. A few leaned toward one another, confused, uncertain. The footage had been carefully chosen for maximum ambiguity. It was the oldest trick in the playbook: sever context, inject fear, and dress it as concern. Shapiro had played this game before. He knew exactly how to seed doubt without ever proving guilt. And for a brief moment, it worked. The audience, hungry for clarity, leaned into the narrative he offered them. But just as the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, teetering on the edge of doubt, something unexpected happened. Not on stage, but behind the scenes, where truth often dies quietly, or gets resurrected by those still brave enough to speak. In the narrow-shadowed control booth suspended above the studio like a judge's perch, the room was humming, monitors flickering, audio feeds layered into a dense digital symphony. And then a single frame froze on one technician's screen. He leaned in instinctively, eyes scanning the waveform beneath the video. He wasn't just a tech, he was an editor by training, and what he saw didn't align with the rhythm of uncut truth. Something was wrong. The pacing was off. The waveform was clipped in a pattern he recognized instantly. Mid-sentence cuts, overlaid transitions too smooth to be accidental. He dropped his pen, leaned into the comm system, and spoke directly into the director's ear. "That's not the original cut," he said, quiet but firm. "That segment's been altered. Context removed, lines skipped. It's a splice." The words hung in the control room like a live wire. The director, seasoned and usually unshakable, snapped her head toward the master playback screen. Her eyes flicked across the metadata, time code mismatches, markers out of sequence. Then she turned to the untouched copy of the original footage still queued in their backup system. There, Jasmine's voice carried a completely different message. Calls for nonviolent resistance, appeals for civic engagement, even a line that said explicitly, "We do not meet hate with hate, we meet it with visibility and law." The exact parts that had been erased now screamed louder by their absence. Without waiting for clearance from the producer, the director leaned into her own mic. "We need to roll the full version, now." Her voice was flat, direct, and without negotiation. She raised her hand and signaled to the control floor, two fingers rotating in a circle, the universal sign to override the feed. There was a pause. Then the main studio screen flickered. Shapiro was still speaking, unaware. But behind him, the edited clip was already dissolving. and the raw, uncut truth was about to take the stage. This time, with nothing left out and nowhere left to hide. And just as the manipulated footage threatened to cloud the air with suspicion, Jasmine Crockett did what few dared to do on live television. She demanded the truth, raw and uninterrupted, with all of America watching. She turned toward the control booth, her voice clear, calm, and louder than any outrage in the room. There was no hesitation, no tremor. Only resolve, spoken like a verdict. I request the full unedited video, right now, on this stage, before the American people. Her words cut through the theater of the moment and landed with the force of someone reclaiming a stolen truth. The audience froze, not out of obedience but instinct. Even Shapiro stopped mid-sentence, lips still parted, his rhythm shattered by the certainty in her tone. In the control room above, the director didn't wait for debate. The signal had already come in. They'd seen the real footage. They'd seen the lie. And now, with Crockett's public call, there was no turning back. The screen went black. Then a caption, "Please stand by, technical review in progress." A hush swept through the studio like a vacuum sucking the air from every chest. The lights dimmed slightly, as if the stage itself were holding its breath. For 2 minutes, no one moved. No one spoke. Phones were still, hands were clenched. It wasn't a pause, it was a storm gathering behind a curtain, a reckoning cued in digital files and final timestamps. Crockett stood motionless, her chin raised, her eyes fixed on the screen with the stillness of someone who has nothing to hide. Shapiro stared forward, jaw tense, fingers tapping against the desk. A man realizing control was slipping through the cracks of a narrative he thought he owned. And then, without fanfare, the screen lit up again. No dramatic music, no commentary, just the raw video, dated and time-stamped, playing in real time from the same town hall. This time it wasn't a chopped 12-second clip. It was the full 3-minute segment. Jasmine stood before a crowd of constituents, hands open, not clenched, her voice filled not with rage, but with righteous calm. The missing context came first, her voice steady. We confront injustice not to destroy, but to build. We will not answer hate with hate. We will be loud, yes, but we will be lawful, visible, unapologetic, and peaceful. There was no threat, no incitement, just a firm, impassioned plea for justice. The full quote, now made whole, undermined the narrative Shapiro had just tried to weave seconds before. He didn't need to be interrupted. The video itself was the interruption. It was the exoneration, the exposure, the counterpunch without fists, and the effect was immediate. A woman in the third row exhaled audibly, clutching her chest. A man behind her whispered, "They cut that out?" The sound booth remained dead silent. No direction, no input, just stunned eyes fixed on the feed they now knew had been tampered with before. Shapiro shifted in his seat, shoulders no longer squared. His eyes darted toward the monitor, and for the first time all night, he looked small. Smaller than his rhetoric, smaller than the machine he had built to shape public perception. The power of editing had been his sword, but tonight it had cut back. Crockett didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She just stood in the presence of the truth, now finally restored to its full shape. The screen faded to black again, and this time, the silence didn't feel like suspense. It felt like awe. The moderator, who until then had struggled to regain control, finally stepped in. Her voice came softly, nearly reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, looking between Crockett, the screen, and the audience with a tremble in her breath, "you are witnessing a moment in live television history." No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't the kind of victory you celebrate. It was the kind you absorb, like a verdict handed down from something higher than any headline. A moment where one woman stood still, while the world finally saw what had been done to her in the shadows of post-production and politics. The truth had spoken, not with fire, not with fury, but with clarity. And for once, it wasn't interrupted. And just when the air had barely begun to settle, when the damage from the doctored video had fully turned against him, Jasmine Crockett reached once more into her arsenal. This time not to defend herself, but to expose the rot behind the very empire that claimed the moral high ground. She moved deliberately, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. The camera zoomed in as she unlatched the side pocket of her leather binder and pulled out 2 sheets of paper, crisp, official, marked with signatures. She held them up, not for drama, but for evidence. Her tone dropped into something colder now, measured, merciless, surgical. "You speak so freely about integrity, Ben," she began, her eyes never leaving his. "But the money behind your words tells a very different story." She tapped the first document, lifting it between her fingers. "This is a wire transfer record, $275,000 paid to the Daily Wire Media Fund from an Eastern European holding company, Melvona Group. Ring a bell?" She didn't wait for him to answer. Her left hand raised the second document, a printed email highlighted in yellow. "And this is your name, Ben, approving that transaction, right here with your signature, dated 4 days after that group was flagged by EU intelligence for contributing to an Austrian ultranationalist pack." The room didn't gasp. It inhaled and never exhaled. The lights seemed to dim slightly as the energy shifted yet again. Crockett stepped forward just half a pace, not as intimidation, but as punctuation. "You talk about preserving Western values, but I have in my hands an IRS-verified document confirming this donation was funneled through a political shell organization once tied to far-right militant groups in Vienna." She paused only for a second, then added almost as an afterthought, "These aren't allegations, Ben. They're line items. Traced, certified, publicly verifiable." The moderator blinked twice, visibly rattled, then leaned toward her mic as if to intervene, her voice wavering. "Congresswoman, I think we should—" But it was too late. The story had already detonated. Shapiro didn't speak immediately. His face tightened. His hand fumbled with the corner of the desk, fingers curling slightly. The audience held still, as if waiting to hear what a man says when the curtain is pulled back and there's nothing left behind it. His voice, when it finally came, was thinner than before, lacking its usual certitude, stripped of the polish he'd mastered so well. "This is politically motivated fiction," he muttered, "a desperate smear meant to distract from—" But even he didn't finish the sentence. It was like he knew the ground beneath him was already gone. The audience didn't erupt. They froze, stone still. Not because they were unsure who to believe, but because the force of what had just unfolded was still computing. Some viewers reached for their phones, others sat back as if physically impacted. The producers in the booth began whispering frantically into headsets, their eyes darting between feeds, wondering whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. But the director made no move. She, like everyone else, recognized what this had become. This was no longer a political sparring match. It was exposure. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply lowered the documents back into her folder, zipped it shut, and looked directly into the camera. Not at Shapiro, not at the moderator, but at the people watching, the ones who'd been told for years that voices like hers were angry, ungrateful, dangerous. "You don't have to believe me," she said, "but you should ask why these documents exist and why no one on that side ever expected you'd see them." She leaned back in her chair, silent, firm, and utterly unshaken. And in that moment, it was clear. The empire wasn't just bleeding. It had been bought, hollowed out, and repackaged as truth. And tonight, that package had been opened on live television. And just when it seemed the revelations couldn't dig deeper, when the paper trail had scorched the stage and silenced even the most rehearsed voice, an unseen hand behind the glass chose to press play one final time, unleashing something no document could match. A voice caught in the act of betrayal. Without warning, the studio screen blinked once, then went dark. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure if it was a glitch or another scheduled segment. But then, through the overhead speakers, a crackle of audio began to play. No video, just sound. Tinny, raw, unfiltered. A male voice came through, sharp, clipped, unmistakably that of Ben Shapiro. The date stamp was embedded in the top right corner of the screen, 4 days before the televised debate. We need to label Crockett as a national threat, the voice said. There was a pause, as if he was checking for silence in the room before continuing. It doesn't matter how much we have to cut from the footage. She needs to be framed as dangerous, loud, emotional, divisive. Make her unpalatable. Make her the villain. Gasps spread like a ripple through the studio. Viewers at home likely missed a heartbeat. And then came the line that changed everything. We need to label Crockett as an enemy of America, no matter how much we have to cut the video to get there. The words didn't just hang in the air. They detonated. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The tone, the cadence, the intent, it was all there, naked and damning. In the control room, no one admitted who hit play. Later, no one would need to, because the moment had already embedded itself into the bloodstream of the broadcast. This wasn't an edit. This wasn't a leaked memo. This was a man in his own voice, articulating a deliberate strategy to distort truth for political gain. It wasn't just opposition, it was war by narrative. On stage, Shapiro froze. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, because there was no playbook for this. No snark, no deflection, no spreadsheet to hold up. His image pixelated slightly on the monitor behind him, like even the broadcast equipment was distancing itself. His hands sat folded, but lifeless, disconnected from the man who had once wielded control over every frame, every soundbite. And now one sentence had turned his greatest weapon, editing, into a confession. The room was dead silent, no clapping, no gasping, just stillness. Even the moderator seemed paralyzed, her eyes wide, her fingers trembling slightly above the cue cards in her lap. No one had anticipated this. No one had planned for a moment so searing it burned through every assumption of fairness, of process, of neutrality. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett stood. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, with intention. Her movements carried no urgency because truth doesn't rush. It waits, it watches, it rises when everything else collapses. She turned to face the camera, not to the audience, not to Shapiro, but to the millions of people who had been told, time and again, that their voices were too loud, too angry, too threatening to be trusted. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe deeply. She simply spoke. "I am not offended," she said, her voice low and sharp as glass. "I am not hurt." Her eyes didn't waver. "Because this was never about me." She took one step forward. The lights above her seemed to dim in contrast to her clarity. "It's the truth that was assaulted. It's the truth that he abused, turned into a weapon, aimed at the very people it was meant to protect." The camera tightened on her face, catching not defiance, but something more powerful. Endurance. There was no need to raise her voice. The silence did that for her. The silence of a studio finally stripped of its illusions. The silence of an audience witnessing propaganda collapse in real time. The silence of a man whose empire of opinion had just been shattered by the sound of his own voice. Jasmine held the gaze of the lens for a moment longer, then spoke one final sentence. Measured, unshakable. "This isn't a debate anymore. This is a reckoning, and every lie that built this stage just crumbled beneath it." No one moved, because no one could. The truth wasn't a headline. It wasn't even a scandal. It was a moment that broke the spell and exposed the machinery that kept it spinning. But when the weight of the truth finally pressed down on him, when his carefully curated narrative began to crack under the light, Shapiro broke, not with strategy or reason, but with something more primal. Outrage. Ben Shapiro's face flushed a deep, angry red. His chest heaved slightly as he stood up from his seat, almost knocking it over in his haste. His eyes locked onto Jasmine, not with the calculated detachment he had maintained throughout the evening, but with a raw, desperate fury. For the first time, he was visibly rattled. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that the knuckles went white. "I am an Orthodox Jew," he spat, his voice louder than it had been all night. "I understand the danger of propaganda, the kind of hatred it can stir. And you, Congresswoman, you are doing exactly what they did. You are using this stage, this platform, to stoke division, to incite violence. You are the one spreading lies." His words shot through the air like bullets, fast and sharp. His usual calculated cadence was replaced with raw emotion, the frustration of someone who could feel control slipping away. The studio, once full of a tense but managed quiet, now buzzed with his outrage. The audience shifted, uncertain whether to react with applause or jeers, their eyes flickering between Shapiro's sudden outburst and Jasmine, who hadn't moved an inch. But Crockett? She stayed calm. Her eyes never left his. Her posture didn't change. She didn't stand up, didn't lean forward, didn't match his intensity with her own. Instead, she remained seated, her hands folded in front of her breathing slow and even. It was the stillness that struck hardest, the calm before a storm that had already passed. She exhaled once, just enough for the words to form, but not so loudly that anyone could mistake them for a reaction. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "The truth doesn't need to shout, Ben." She let the words hang in the air, deliberate and final. "It just needs to be illuminated." The tension in the room thickened, every eye now on her, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding. They had heard the man. They had seen his anger, his distortion, and now here was the response. Not a defense, but a simple unveiling. The weight of Crockett's words was enough to press down on the atmosphere, to weigh it with the quiet strength that only someone truly unshaken can possess. For a moment, everything paused. Even Shapiro seemed to freeze, his chest still rising and falling with shallow breaths. But it wasn't just him. The entire room had shifted. The energy had changed. No longer was it about who could shout the loudest or wield the most fiery rhetoric. It was about something more uncomfortable: accountability, the harsh, bright light of truth that would not be hidden. And then, without warning, it happened. The audience, once divided, stood in unison, but it wasn't in celebration, it wasn't in applause. They stood in silence, still quiet, a unified moment of acknowledgement. The room didn't fill with clapping or cheering. It filled with something deeper, something more meaningful. They stood not because of the words that had been spoken, but because of the gravity with which they had been delivered. Crockett wasn't just speaking to Shapiro. She was speaking to them. She was speaking to the millions who watched, to the unseen viewers who lived and breathed in silence while their truth was twisted or erased. No one moved, no one cheered. But the collective acknowledgement hung in the air like a palpable weight, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't just a moment of victory, it was a shift. A moment where the truth had been spoken so plainly, so simply, that the only possible response was silence, reverence, and recognition. Crockett sat, unmoving, as the room around her trembled, not from the chaos of conflict, but from the quiet storm of a truth that no one could escape. She had said what needed to be said, not to win, but to show that truth is not a weapon. It's a shield. And in that moment, it had protected her. The camera zoomed in on her face, not for the drama of the moment, but because the camera knew something had changed. The angle shifted, and for a brief second, the light caught her eyes. Steady, unwavering, like a beacon in a storm that refused to let anyone else decide what it was supposed to look like. The moderator, who had sat frozen during the last exchange, now cleared her throat awkwardly, her voice hesitant, but powerful in its own way. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her words coming slower now, measured as if she, too, had been hit with the weight of what had just transpired. "You are witnessing history unfold, a confrontation not just between two people, but between two realities." Shapiro, still standing, his face flushed with frustration, opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell, but the words he had always been so quick to deliver, those sharp, premeditated insults, the calculated hits, had evaporated. For the first time that night, he was speechless, not because he lacked a rebuttal, but because the truth had spoken louder than his carefully constructed narrative. Crockett didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her gaze was on the moment, not on the man, not on the audience, but on the weight of everything that had just transpired. She knew the truth was out there now, and it would never again be silenced. As the camera lights dimmed and the studio began to clear, the echoes of the debate didn't fade. They reverberated, swelling across the internet, where the truth had finally found its own voice, louder than any edited clip, louder than any distortion. Within hours of the live broadcast, social media was a storm, an avalanche of tweets, reposts, and trending hashtags. The screens of millions of phones lit up across the country, flashing words that had once been reserved for obscure blogs and whisper campaigns. Truth over tactics and Crockett debate victory skyrocketed to #1 on Twitter, dominating every news feed, every trending topic. The hashtags weren't just responses, they were declarations. They were the new rallying cry of people tired of seeing their voices twisted and sold for profit. The discussion spiraled beyond just political lines. It became a movement, a collective reckoning that had been building for years. Users from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in. Some criticized, others cheered. But one thing was clear. Crockett's words had ignited something in the collective consciousness. Her calm had been the fire starter. On television screens, on computers, and across every social media platform, people who had once felt unheard, overlooked, and silenced found a voice in that moment. They saw themselves in her, unapologetically standing up, unwavering in the face of manipulation, demanding the truth be heard. And with every retweet, with every new post, the truth expanded. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. The truth that had been hidden in plain sight had now come to light. It had been cut, edited, and distorted, but it was now raw and undeniable. As the digital world erupted in response, Jasmine Crockett sat in the empty studio, the tension of the evening finally starting to unwind in her chest. She wasn't smiling. There was no relief on her face, only the quiet, hard-won recognition that she had done what she came to do. She had stood up not to win the argument, but to stop losing, to stop letting the truth be buried beneath lies and distractions. The weight of the night, of all the battles fought in silence before this moment, was heavy, but there was a sense of satisfaction in it. She had broken through, and the truth had broken through with her. As the lights in the studio began to dim, the camera caught one last image of Crockett, her face calm, resolute. The stage was empty now, the energy dissipating into the dark. But there was something more lasting in the quiet, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the air, as if the world had just exhaled. This wasn't just a political victory. It was a victory for transparency, for accountability, for every person who had ever felt their voice was too small to matter. The camera angle pulled back, the vast expanse of the now empty studio looming behind her. In the corner of the screen, an iconic message flickered into view. The words, simple yet powerful, appeared in bold letters, hanging in the silence of the moment. In a world full of edited truths, be the raw footage. The message lingered, suspended in time, as the stage lights finally faded to black, leaving the screen in darkness. But the final words still echoed. The words weren't just a slogan, they were a challenge. A challenge to all who had been silenced, to all who had been ignored, to anyone who had ever been told their voice wasn't loud enough. It wasn't just about the fight Jasmine had won that night. It was about the larger fight she had reignited, the fight for transparency, the fight for truth. And as the darkness took over the screen, the message remained. The world for a moment stood still. But even as the lights dimmed and the world moved on, the echoes of that final message reverberated far beyond the studio, echoing in the hearts of those who had been waiting for their moment to speak, for their truth to finally be seen. The next morning, the world woke up to something that felt different. The political landscape, with its usual din of talking points and headline-chasing sound bites, was momentarily silenced by the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's victory. News outlets, once comfortable with their partisan ruts, found themselves grappling with an undeniable shift in public sentiment. The truth comes to light. Crockett's victory over media manipulation screamed the front page of the New York Times. Congresswoman Crockett takes on Shapiro, and the truth wins, flashed in bold print across the Washington Post. Even cable networks, which thrived on sensationalism, found themselves cornered by a story that transcended party lines. It wasn't just about Crockett and Shapiro anymore. It was about something larger, a reckoning for a media culture that had long twisted facts to fit its narrative. Across social media, the hashtags were relentless. Truth over tactics and Crockett debate victory didn't fade into the abyss after the initial burst of excitement. They lingered, gaining momentum, snowballing into a movement that reached far beyond the initial debate. People who had once been quiet, unsure if their voices mattered, began to speak out. Truth over tactics became more than a rallying cry for political wonks. It became a manifesto for those who had been silenced, ignored, and marginalized. It was a cry for transparency in a world where it often felt like truth was buried under layers of misdirection. Jasmine Crockett had not simply won a debate, she had sparked something new. Something that was less about winning an argument and more about awakening an entire nation to the idea that the truth had been compromised, manipulated, and obscured for far too long. For weeks, the airwaves buzzed with discussions about the implications of her words. Her calm, her resolve, her absolute refusal to back down. These things resonated, and the echo of that truth reverberated across the political divide. For every attack, there was a counterattack from those who recognized the significance of what had just happened. Even the media outlets that had initially tried to dismiss Crockett's message began to shift. The same talking heads who had scoffed at her a few weeks prior now found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable reality that they had been complicit in perpetuating narratives that were not only false but damaging. The people who had ridiculed her as just another politician with a loud voice began to reconsider. Because in that one decisive moment, Jasmine had revealed something about them, not just about her. She had shown that the very institutions that claimed to protect truth were, in fact, the ones distorting it. She had exposed the machinery of manipulation that had been churning behind the scenes for so long. Across the nation, ordinary people found themselves waking up to a new kind of activism, the kind that didn't require sensational headlines or viral moments, but was rooted in a deep, unshakable commitment to the truth. This wasn't about political parties. This wasn't about media networks. This was about something more fundamental, an urgent, collective recognition that truth had been buried, and it was time to uncover it. As Crockett walked through the halls of Congress in the following weeks, she was met not with the usual disdain that often accompanies political figures in contentious environments, but with quiet nods of respect. Not from her colleagues in the usual sense, but from the people, ordinary citizens who stopped her in the hallway, who shook her hand and said, "You gave us a voice." Those words weighed more than any victory she could have claimed in the debate. They reminded her that what had happened wasn't just a political win, it was a moral one. In the quiet moments as her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support, Crockett reflected on what had truly transpired that night. It wasn't just about exposing Shapiro for his hypocrisy or about the victory she had claimed in that moment. It was about what that moment represented, a shift, a moment where the veil of distortion had been lifted, and the people, regardless of their political affiliation, were invited to see the truth for what it was. Her words had been simple, measured, but potent. The truth doesn't need to shout, Ben. It just needs to be illuminated. And illuminated it was. It wasn't just a debate, not anymore. It was a turning point, a moment when the world finally recognized that the truth, when stripped of its manipulation, could stand stronger than any narrative. The battle had not been fought in the words they exchanged. It had been fought in the silence that followed. In the silence, the truth stood unwavering, immune to the noise of distractions. In the aftermath, Crockett was inundated with support from every corner. Political allies, civil rights activists, and even everyday citizens began sharing their own stories. They spoke of the times they had been silenced, by the media, by powerful interests, or by society's indifference. Truth over tactics became a voice for the voiceless. It became a cry for transparency, for accountability, for a new kind of leadership. And as the movement grew, it became clear that the battle was far from over. But Jasmine didn't bask in the attention. She didn't seek accolades. She understood that the victory wasn't about her. It was about the truth being heard. She had played her part, and now the people had to play theirs. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was the beginning of a deeper, more sustained fight. It wasn't about winning one debate. It was about ensuring that the truth could no longer be buried by those who profit from deception. As the lights in the studio dimmed, signaling the end of another chapter, Crockett stood for a brief moment, allowing the gravity of everything to settle. The world had seen her. The world had heard her. And now it was time for the world to act. The final image lingered on the screen for just a beat longer than usual. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a challenge to everyone watching, to everyone who had ever been forced to speak louder to be heard. The words appeared in stark, simple text. In a world full of edited truth, be the raw footage. The lights finally flickered to black. The camera faded and the stage fell silent. And in that silence, something shifted. Not because of one debate, but because of the power of one truth, unapologetically spoken. And as the lights dimmed and the world watched in stunned silence, the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's journey began to unfold. Not in the applause, but in the deeper understanding of what had been exposed that night. The story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a victory in the typical sense. It was a lesson about the kind of courage that doesn't shout to be heard, but demands space to exist. In a world where voices are constantly manipulated, drowned out by the noise of powerful forces, Crockett's steadfastness became a beacon, not because of the debate she won, but because of the fight she waged in silence. The truth she revealed was one that couldn't be drowned by the noise of a single debate or the manipulation of media. It was a truth that had been buried, ignored, and distorted. But in that moment, it was brought into the light for everyone to see. What made her journey different from so many others who had faced the same battle was her ability to see through the fog of distraction and deception, to step forward not with the intent of victory, but with the intent to simply be seen. The injustice that had been perpetrated against her wasn't just the misrepresentation of her words or the accusations of rage and division. The real injustice lay in the system that allowed that distortion to happen over and over again. It was a system that catered to the powerful, the wealthy, the loud. A system that bent to the will of those who had access to the microphone, the platform, and the spotlight. But Crockett, in her quiet defiance, took that system head-on. She didn't just fight for her own voice, she fought for the millions of people whose voices had been silenced by the very machinery she exposed. The injustice she faced wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It was the weight of decades of media manipulation, the subtle but insidious ways that truth had been replaced with sensationalism, the constant pushing of narratives that served the powerful while ignoring the needs of the people. The people who had been marginalized, misunderstood, and ignored for so long were finally given a voice, not by shouting louder than the others, but by standing firm, unshaken, and unwavering in their commitment to truth. And so, as the world watched the fallout of that debate, the viral hashtags, the articles, the reactions, what became clear was not that Crockett had simply defeated Ben Shapiro in a debate. What became clear was that she had taken the first step in a much larger battle. She had opened the door to a conversation that had been closed for too long, and in doing so, she had shown the world the true power of speaking truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. The lesson here, however, went beyond politics, beyond rhetoric. It was about standing in the face of injustice and saying, "This cannot stand." It was about confronting the systems that benefit from misinformation and manipulation, and daring to ask for accountability. Crockett showed that the real battle wasn't about winning a debate. It was about exposing the forces that work tirelessly to keep people in the dark, to keep them unaware, to keep them silent. And the power in that moment was not in the loudest voice, but in the quiet, unshakable stance of one person who refused to be silenced. Her words, though calm, resonated with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. "I don't want applause," she had said, and in that moment, she had revealed the heart of the issue. "I want awareness." She wasn't asking for the world to cheer her on. She wasn't asking for praise. She was asking for something far more profound. She was asking for the truth to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be seen. It was a stark reminder that we live in a world where the loudest voices are not always the ones telling the truth. In fact, the loudest voices are often the ones most invested in bearing it. Those who have the power to amplify their message are not always the ones who speak for justice. They are often the ones who use their power to keep the truth hidden. But Crockett's moment, her stand, shattered that illusion. The lesson was clear. Truth is not something that is handed down from the powerful. It is something that is claimed by those who are willing to stand, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, and say, this is what matters. Her journey wasn't just a fight against one man or one moment. It was a battle against a system that had long relied on manipulation to maintain its hold. She didn't just expose Ben Shapiro. She exposed the way the media and the political system had been complicit in creating a world where truth was optional, where facts were shaped to fit an agenda. In doing so, she sparked a wider conversation about accountability, transparency, and the moral imperative to hold those in power to the truth. And this was the true lesson of her story. It was a lesson about the importance of truth in a world that often seeks to suppress it. It was about the moral courage required to stand in that gap, to confront injustice directly, and to insist that no matter how loud the distortion becomes, the truth will always find a way to be heard. Crockett's stand was not about the glory of being right. It was about the responsibility of ensuring that the truth is never lost. The world had witnessed the unmasking of a system that had been hiding in plain sight. And in doing so, Crockett had shown the world that the fight for truth is not over. It is ongoing. It is relentless. But in the end, the truth will always find a way to shine through. The light of that truth cannot be extinguished by manipulation or deceit. And as Crockett's words echoed in the hearts and minds of millions, they became the catalyst for change, a shift that would continue to build, quietly but powerfully, in the hearts of those who understood the importance of standing for what is right. Because at the end of it all, what Jasmine Crockett proved was this: when the world tries to bury the truth, you don't need to shout louder. You simply need to be the truth, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic. And in doing so, you become the beacon that guides others to speak their own truth, to stand tall, and to demand the justice that has long been denied. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.